Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Democrats are gearing up for another run at Eastern Shore Congressman Andy Harris. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In past election cycles, the odds were always long against the man who unseated the more moderate Wayne Gilchrist in the 2008 GOP primary. 2 years later, he swept into office with a Republican tie brought in by the Tea Party. Since then, his district has been reconfigured to make it even more Republican. But many national analysts are now expecting a Democratic wave next year in reaction to the Trump administration. And this year, candidates are beginning to appear on the Democratic side, and one of them is Mike Pullen. He spent 24 years as an attorney for the Talbot County Council and is currently a member of Talbot Rising, a nonpartisan grassroots organization. But next year, he hopes to capture the Democratic nomination to challenge Harris. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be able to sit with you this morning and talk about this. It's pretty exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. We're in the process of we're in an exploratory phase at this point. I haven't filed yet officially, but we're hoping to put together an organization, and we believe that there is a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, a lot of people want change from this administration, and we're looking forward to hopefully a good campaign.
Well, let me just refer to something I mentioned a moment ago. That is that, at least in years past, ever since Congressman Harris was elected to the office, he's had a fairly sure thing. He's beaten certainly Democratic opponents. Ran across some stats the other day. District 1 has something like 223,000 Republicans, 176,000 Democrats, 88,000 independents, about 7,500 other affiliations. In short, looks like you have a long haul to go there, especially, you'd have to get to the independents, and that probably puts you over the top, but that's still a long haul to do. How do you overcome that kind of lopsided Republican representation in the district?
Well, I think voter turnout will be key. I think the message will obviously be key. I think that people are concerned about Washington. I think people are concerned about the dysfunction in Congress. I think people are concerned about our representative, his lack of accountability, his lack of substance on important issues that matter to people, his recent vote on the health care bill. I think people are engaged. I think people are enthusiastic. I think people are paying close attention. I think people are going to hold Representative Harris accountable, and I think that we can generate a great deal of turnout. I think that people are anxious for change, and that's what our campaign is going to be about.
Because if you go potentially across the Eastern Shore, see a lot of Trump signs, and they're still up, as a matter of fact. Do you think that represents then still some strong support for him? And obviously Andy Harris, or are you depending upon more votes coming from the Western Shore? How do you configure that out?
Well, we're still in the preliminary phase of our campaign, and the voter activation file, we haven't got that yet. So we don't have a specific plan in place at this point, but we will have that. I think that certainly President Trump has a core support that still supports him. We believe that those folks are going to be able to be persuadable at some point, perhaps not right now. As things move forward, we're hoping more for the independent vote. We're hoping to energize the Democrats. And we're hoping just for a large turnout. I think that when we get a large turnout, Democrats do better. No doubt we have a large deficit to overcome, but I believe in my view is that the message that we have will resonate with voters. I think that we are going to speak to concerns that voters have about health care, Medicare, Medicaid, those type of things, and issues that matter. So the environment, the Chesapeake Bay, sea level rise, those are the things that matter to the shore, matter to the First District.
Now, this is a district that you're going to be looking at midterms, which is not impossible to make gains. We saw that from the Democrats in 2006. But it's white, it's conservative, it's older. It's not a presidential year, nonetheless. How do you appeal to those voters who look at Donald Trump and who, for instance, may look at Andy Harris and say, those are my people? I mean, we saw recently the election in Montana, where Donald Trump is apparently still fairly popular. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you break through that?
Well, I think ultimately it's going to be up to the voters to decide. Our job is to give them a real choice and a real decision and a viable alternative. We have a message. We have a view of how government should work. My job is to make that view known to the voters, to tell them what I believe that I can bring to the table, bring the experience that I have in problem solving with local government. I worked with the county council for 24 years before, and worked as 40 years as a lawyer in Easton. So I bring some problem-solving skills. I bring a vision of what democracy can be for the people of the First District as a true representative. My view is that the first order of business for a congressman is to actually listen to the people in the district, listen to what they want him to address, find solutions for those problems, and bring those solutions to the table in Congress and propose legislation that actually helps folks in their ordinary daily lives. I don't think that Congressman Harris does that. I believe that he's more ideologically driven by an agenda that really that has little to do with the district. For example, his recent vote on the health care bill, the second iteration, which was even harsher than the first, came out of a month-long deliberation, came out of Congress fully baked, no public input, no public comment, no opportunity for public discussion or not even a rating by the Congressional Budget Office before the House voted on it. And what that says to me is that the House does not care about the American public, that our representative does not care about what the people in this district think or what their opinions are. That's not how democracy works. We have to take back our government, and the first step is making our voices heard in Congress. And my message will be that I will listen to the people of the First District. I can represent their interests. That's what I've done for 40 years, is represent my clients' interests, not my own. And that's what I'm good at, and that's what I have a passion for, and that's what I want to do for the people of the First District.
By the way, what did you make of the recent town hall with Congressman Harris? I know you were there. I happened to be there as well. How representative do you think that is of the district, and what kinds of things or issues do you see having driven the kind of turnout and obviously the response, which was fairly, well, I think to say hostile, I suppose, is a good word, but certainly rowdy in terms of its response to that congressman. And was that? And I heard, I've heard talked to some conservatives who felt it was disrespectful.
Well, democracy is sometimes a messy process, and when people are not being listened to, when people's voices are being ignored, when people are not being given a fair opportunity to express their views, people get angry and people get upset, and that's part of the process. And I think it's a symptom of the underlying lack of interest on Representative Harris's part to actually listen to people and to take their views into account. I don't think it was particularly disrespectful. I do think that it is part of the American process. Politics can be direct, blunt, and I think it needs to be. When we reach points where there is an obvious disconnect between a large segment of what people of the people's will and actions in Congress, people are going to be upset. And it's not just in the 1st District, it's all throughout the United States. I mean, this is not uncommon. This is actually very common now. And I think it's a healthy reaction to what we see in Congress. I think it's a very understandable reaction, and I think we're going to see more of it unless and until Congress becomes more responsive to the will of the American people.
Turning to health care for a moment. Obviously, the Affordable Care Act has certainly developed certain problems. We've seen some high premiums, although only in certain states. We've seen a lot of insurance companies pulling out of some of the markets. You only have, say, for instance, one, for instance, in a particular county. Obviously, I think you would want to continue the Affordable Care Act. What kinds of solutions are you thinking that you would like to see to shore up some of the shortcomings that we're seeing within the ACA?
Well, I think you're correct. I mean, I do think that there are problems with the ACA that everyone is aware of, and I do think that the solution is attending to those problems. Those problems are actually a lot smaller and a lot more manageable than creating a whole brand new system. The disruption to the insurance markets, the disruption to the nationwide delivery of healthcare services is incalculable. For example, we have a proposed relocation of our hospital in Easton. One of the requirements for that to happen is that the hospital has to develop and propose and have approved a system for reimbursement. When you are removing and changing the entire reimbursement system, that throws that process into chaos. It is automatically going to delay it indefinitely at this point. And it's actually much more efficient, much more cost-effective, much simpler if you can simply deal with the problems that you know that you have. Healthcare is a very complicated issue, and it's in any large-scale effort like the ACA, there are predictable issues that are going to need to be resolved. That is exactly what Congress is designed to do as the framers intended it. I mean, the framers intended that there would be compromise, that there would be discussion, that there would be a democratic process where competing interests were brought to the table and considered fairly. That's the way that problems get solved. That's the way that this problem can be solved. It's not a one-side ideological solution fits all, and we throw out the ACA entirely and go to really what is a draconian elimination of health care for millions of people, and throwing others into financial uncertainty, throwing people with pre-existing conditions into both financial and emotional uncertainty. And it's just not an acceptable way for government to operate, in my opinion.
I would take it you don't agree with the president who says that the ACA is done, it's collapsed, it's in a death spiral. We hear that often from the GOP.
No, I don't agree with that. In Maryland, as a matter of fact, it works very well. And the data that showed that it worked very well was actually on the Department of Health and Human Services website, which was a federal agency. up until the new administration took office, and then very shortly thereafter, all of that data was removed. But the data still exists on the Department of Legislative Services website, which is the state website. And that data is very, very positive. As you know, Maryland did expand the Medicaid benefit, and that if that is withdrawn, the projections are that the state will lose $2 billion a year in federal funding for health care. The effect of that is going to be either a massive reduction in service or a massive restructuring of how Maryland administers and delivers health care. Either one is completely unnecessary. I mean, the Affordable Care Act was working and is working in Maryland and does not need to be repealed or replaced. It can be tweaked and made to work even better.
One of the big issues that certainly drove Trump into the White House has been free trade agreements and free trade. Up until, as a matter of fact, Trump's candidacy, the Republican Party was actually the party of free trade. Now there's been a shift in talking about protecting jobs and getting fair trade agreements. Where are you on the issue of fair trade or free trade? And might you also, ironically, be maybe sliding a little more towards Trump in the sense of, well, wait a minute, maybe these things don't work as well as they did, such as NAFTA?
Well, that's a good question, Don, and it's one that I'm not. I don't have. Let me say this: to the extent these free trade agreements have undermined American jobs, then I think that they need to be revisited and changed. I'm glad that the recent one in the Pacific was eliminated. That was a bad idea. I think that NAFTA has caused a great deal of disruption to American jobs. For example, we used to have a Black & Decker plant in Easton. It employed 2,400 people on really 24 hours a day originally. That plant, after NAFTA came in, that plant moved first to, I believe, North Carolina, and then right over the border from Brownsville, Texas. And the folks that work there earn on average $50 a week. And the price of the goods that Black & Decker manufactures hasn't been reduced. So in effect, what they've done is they've taken the good jobs from Easton, exported them to Mexico, paid the folks in Mexico barely a living wage, if you can call it that, and kept the price of the goods the same. And so what happens there? All of the money that was being distributed to the folks that were creating the products, the middle class, is now going to the corporate headquarters and being distributed that way and not to the middle class. The loss of jobs is obvious, and that's something that we need to address. So yes, in terms of those free trade agreements, I think they need to be looked at, and we need to do what we have to do to protect the American middle class and the jobs that used to exist here in the country. We need to keep them and make those grow.
I want to turn to the environment and certainly the Chesapeake Bay restoration. The Trump administration tried to eliminate the Bay Restoration funds. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. Certainly, and Andy Harris, for that matter, has said that he favors keeping them in. How do you balance the environment on the one hand and say something like agricultural poultry on the other? There's been a long-standing conflict in terms of the poultry industry and the environment, certainly with environmentalists. How do you strike that balance?
Another good question. and one I'm not quite ready to answer because I don't know the arguments pro and con on either side.
But what would be your principles? How would you approach it?
Well, I would approach that problem the same way that I approach every problem, which is first listening to both sides, getting a full and complete picture of the facts and the data and the effects of the decisions, the pros and the cons, learning what the options are, learning where there is middle ground, where there is opportunity to compromise and actually create something better than what either party may have originally sought. Working with both sides, trying to reach a solution that is acceptable to both. That's what I've done, and that's what I can do. That's my approach to problem solving. And if there are problems that are insolvable in terms of either people's expectations or what the minimum requirements that either side may insist on, and in those instances, you just have to make the call on your own if you're the decision maker, and try to implement it the best way you can, and be open to amendments if amendments are proposed that make sense, and get the job done.
But on the international front, we've seen a foreign policy, at least under the administration, which seems to be pulling back somewhat. A lot of emphasis on terrorism, for example. What do you make of that kind of foreign policy? How engaging do you think the country should be internationally? And particularly, obviously, we still have that simmering war going on in Afghanistan.
Well, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question.
What would be your approach? How engaged do you think the country should be, as opposed to, say, the kind of approach that the Trump administration, which is sort of symbolized by America First?
Well, I think we should be engaged, but I think we should be engaged diplomatically. I think we should be engaged as a cooperative partner with other nations. I don't think that our military force is the tool for diplomacy. I don't think that our standing in the world is enhanced when we threaten and bully. And I don't think our military, I have the greatest respect. My family is a military family, and I've had ancestors in every war that this country has ever fought, going back to the Revolution. So I fully understand and respect the military. But I don't think that they are the proper tool for diplomatic solutions. I think that we need to use our economic standing in the world, our moral standing in the world, which I think we need to work on significantly. I do think that we need to be an example. I think that our immigration policy, for example, under this administration is exactly the wrong thing. I think it creates animosities and hatred it's completely unnecessary, and it's not what this country has stood for or should stand for. I think that it's morally indefensible to disallow children and families and refugees that are being bombed and killed in their country and threatened with to deny them access to this country is not what we're about. I think that we need to recapture our moral standing in the world. I do think that our approach should be a collaborative one, cooperative one. I think we need to work with other nations, all nations, to build a better, more peaceful, and a more secure world.
Turning to what's been going on in Washington, we have been fixated on talk about impeachment, talk about obstruction of justice. We talk about connections with Russia, particularly the president's at least campaign aides, for example. And if you were elected, you could very well facing some kind of proceedings in the House if it goes that far. What's your sense about that investigation? Or do you see obstruction of justice? How are you assessing what you're hearing so far?
A good question, and if I am elected, and if I do sit in the House, I would be a part of that. So I'm not going to comment on my opinions, but what I will tell you is that I think that investigation has to be conducted thoroughly, extensively. Every reasonable lead needs to be pursued, and the American people need to be given the investigation needs to be pursued so that the American people have confidence that it has been conducted properly, fairly, and thoroughly. And the investigation needs to go where the facts lead it, without bias, intimidation, or concern about where that may lead. It needs to be conducted in a way that the American people have complete confidence that it has been done correctly, and the facts need to be brought out.
Are you concerned about the Russian interference, apparent Russian interference in the elections, and all these connections at least seem to have occurred between the Russians and the campaign? I mean, even the Russian ambassador, I guess it was, inside the Oval Office. What do you make of that connection?
Well, I rely on what the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded, and they've been unanimous that there was influence and if not collaboration. I don't know that they've gone that far yet, but they are unanimous in their opinion that there was interference. And the extent of that and the connection, if any, with the campaign is yet to be determined. But it's clearly a matter of significant concern. It's a significant concern to me, and I think that the American people, we pride ourselves in this country on our history and the vision of our democracy as put in place by our founding fathers. It's not perfect, but it's the best form of government that had been developed at that time. The idea that individual liberty protected by a constitution that was written, the right to vote. The right to vote is probably one of the most significant and important bulwarks of our democracy. And when the election process is subject to interference by foreign nations that do not wish our country well, I think it's cause for serious concern, and I think it demands our full attention, and we've got to get to the bottom of whatever it is that happened, and the American people ultimately need a full disclosure.
How do you judge the competency of this administration?
I don't think the president is qualified to do the job, either by temperament, by background, or training. The concern that I have is that he does not appear to recognize that he needs to rely on others. He thinks, in my view, that he can do this job, and it's clear to me that he has made a number of missteps, a number of misjudgments. He fails to appreciate the significance, the complexity of the decisions that he's faced with. His comments about the intelligence community are simply, well, they speak for themselves, but I find it almost unbelievable that a president can think that the way he does vis-a-vis the intelligence community. He doesn't appear to have a very good grasp of the complexity of the work, the need for international diplomacy. I believe he has eliminated a lot of the funding for the State Department and eliminated most of the senior positions. And I'm not certain how many of those positions have been filled. But by doing that, you create a void in international diplomacy. And things don't stop in the world just because we don't have people filling those posts. What happens is the vacuum that's created gets filled by other players. And that is something that no country, and our country, can't afford and doesn't need. It's a completely self-inflicted wound that is just a reflection of, in my opinion, an incapable management, incompetent management.
I want to turn finally back to local politics in terms of being able to win this seat. I ran across a quote from Heather Mazier, ran for governor at one point, and she says the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is still very old school and won't post cash for races with numbers like the 1st District shows on paper. So we'll take a candidate that can raise cash on his or her own and or fire up the grassroots. That's her assessment. She's been in politics. She has run. Is the Democratic Party going to be really behind you, or are you going to have to develop the cash and fire up grassroots?
Well, Don, I think that's an open question. We certainly have to do two things. We certainly have to raise the funds, and we certainly have to have the grassroots support. The question in my mind, and I think we're in a unique political environment this year, and we've seen that in a number of the races that have already occurred, these special elections. So it's an open question in my mind about how much support will be thrown into the 1st District by the Democratic Party. Obviously, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to generate some enthusiasm and some grassroots support and some fundraising. My campaign is still in the exploratory phase, but we've started some fundraising, and I've got a crowd pack site that's up that is accepting pledges, not donations, but pledges. So it's an open question. I think that we'll have to just leave that open for now and see how it develops.
We've been speaking with Mike Pullen. He is a potential candidate for Congress here in the 1st District to ultimately challenge perhaps Republican Congressman Andy Harris. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thanks very much, Don. Appreciate it.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. For the Delmarva Today schedule, visit pac14.org or view the latest issue of the Daily Times.